Thank you for joining us for our first Jewish Studies public program for the academic year of 2020 and 2021. I'm Chavati Rosh Samuelson, and I'm Regents Professor of History, Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. The Center for Jewish Studies at ASU is a unique hybrid of an academic program and a research center. We serve as an intellectual resource for all aspects of the Jewish experience through the ages, and we cover diverse philosophical, theological, and political perspectives that bear on the study of Judaism. Through undergraduate and graduate courses, our research conferences, public lectures, and exhibits, Jewish Studies at ASU fosters critical inquiry and scholarly entrepreneurship as we disseminate information about Jewish culture. Thereby, we seek to enhance the quality of Jewish life in metropolitan Phoenix and around the world. The current coronavirus pandemic has compelled all of us to conduct our public programs during this academic year via Zoom. In fall 2020, we offer a series entitled Jews and Judaism Today, Some Burning Issues. And tonight is the first lecture in that series. The series will explore topics of interest to the Jewish community today, including gender and sexuality, which is the focus for tonight's lecture, Holocaust and Jewish identity, Black-Jewish relations, Jewish environmentalism, and Jewish genealogical research. In spring 2021, we will hold two research conferences. One will focus on anti-Semitism and liberal democracies, and the other one will focus on Judaism and climate change. In addition, we will have 3 webinars that will explore the meaning and relevance of Jewish studies for Jews and non-Jews today. The full schedule of our programs is available online on the website of Jewish Studies, and the printed version of the calendar will be sent out to all people who are on our mailing list. Please share the information with your friends and family members, and do join us for these public programs. Tonight, I'm very pleased to open our first fall program with a lecture given by my colleague, Professor Madelaine Adelman. Professor Adelman is an anthropologist and professor of Jewish studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. She's the author of Battering States, The Politics of Domestic Violence in Israel. It was published in 2017 by Vanderbilt University Press. She's also the co-editor of Jerusalem, Conflict and Cooperation in a Contested City. That book was published in 2014 by Syracuse University Press. In addition, she has published numerous essays in various academic journals of anthropology, sociology, and justice studies. Professor Adelman is the past president of the Association for Political and Legal Anthropology. She is also very involved in public advocacy on behalf of the LGBT community, both nationally and locally. Professor Adelman is the founder and current board member of GLSEN, an American education organization working to prompt LGBT inclusion and awareness in K-12 schools. And she serves on GLSEN's National Board of Directors and its Executive Committee. This evening, Professor Adelman will talk about the future of gender in Jewish organizations. After the lecture, I will pose 2 or 3 questions to Professor Adelman, and then we will open the webinar to questions from the audience. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And Lisa Kaplan, the Assistant Director for Jewish Studies, will select questions and will present them to Professor Adelman. And now let us tune in to the presentation by Professor Adelman.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Chavatiro Samuelson, Lisa Kaplan, and Dawn Beeson, who make Jewish studies such a vibrant and valuable intellectual home for us at ASU and the greater Phoenix community. I do want to point out that I've been the beneficiary of the support of community members and the center and the Jewish Studies program, who have supported my own course development and research activities. So I really can't go without saying how much I'm grateful for that kind of support that Jewish Studies gives to faculty and to students at ASU. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues across the country, some of whom you might know: Carol Balin, Nan Langowitz, Susan Bass, and especially Rabbi Marla Feldman, who initiated the plenary panel on the topic of the future of single gender organizations at the most recent Women's Conference in May 2020, perhaps one of the first virtual conferences that we had because of COVID, which was sponsored by the Women of Reform Judaism. Marla is subsequently editing a special issue on gender in Jewish life for the CCAR Journal. My comments this evening in part draw on what I've learned as a plenary panelist and as a contributor to that special issue. So I want to also say thank you to my colleagues. Now, regardless of your personal experience of or stance on gender, all of us are constantly navigating gender and renegotiating its meaning and the roles it plays in our lives. The main idea that I'd like to convey this evening is that competing ideas about gender are not new, and that gender, what it means, how it is manifested, why it should be managed in a particular way, is at the heart of all of our Jewish organizations, whether explicitly or implicitly. So this is a call to make explicit what for some is unremarkable, tacit knowledge, and what is for others a quite visible tension between the status quo and the future of gender in our organizations. Let's consider not whether we should be talking about gender in Jewish organizations, but how do we want to talk about it? And my comments this evening are delivered for hopefully the benefits of us as individuals, as members of families, of communities, of organizations, whether we're donors, staff, clients, participants, volunteers, leaders, or aspiring leaders. To help frame this conversation, I invite you to reflect on your own gender story. And I'm going to do that Zoom thing where I share my screen. I'm going to make myself smaller. There we go. So I invite you to think about your own gender story as I make some comments about the place of gender in Jewish organizations. Your own gender story might be somewhere along this continuum between a more rigid gender binary and a more expansive sense of gender. You may remember, for example, David Bowie's lyrics from his 1974 hit song, Rebel Rebel, which went something like, "You've got your mother in a whirl. She's not sure if you're a boy or a girl." Or perhaps you've attended a gender reveal party, which you see on the left side of the screen. It's a trend that was invented in 2008 in the Midwestern United States, when expectant parents hosted an event where they cut into a cake filled with either pink or blue icing to signal whether they were having a boy or a girl. Notably, the woman, the mom who invented this or made it popular has since regretted doing so, and she herself is the mother of a gender nonconforming child. Perhaps you live in one of the 10 states in the United States that now includes 3 gender marker options on birth certificates, M, F, or X. You also may have either opposed or supported the recent Supreme Court decision, which affirmed that the Title VII legal definition of discrimination based on sex includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Perhaps you've been wondering about or using the pronoun they, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And some of you may have been misgendered by a stranger, and maybe felt uncomfortable or threatened by it. You may have been rewarded with compliments or job offers due to how you express your gender. My task here this evening is to examine what we know about gender from multidisciplinary perspectives in order to give us as a community an opportunity to explore its contested yet still prominent role in society, and specifically in our Jewish organizations. Gender is a central way that people in North America classify each other. We assign values to those categories, and we are expected to behave according to the categories to which we have been assigned. And we expect others to do so as well. This is referred to as a society's gender ideology or system. Underlying this gender ideology or system and the work required to uphold it are assumptions that often go unquestioned. And these are the three questions that animate my comments. Is gender a relevant way to categorize people? Are men and women naturally different? And finally, is gender a mutually exclusive binary or something more expansive? So this evening, I'm going to take a step back and briefly explore each of these questions/assumptions. My goal is to unpack them and raise perhaps some new, perhaps provocative questions about the possibilities and pitfalls of single gender organizations and the future of gender more broadly in our organizations, noting that some of our organizations were originally designed to perpetuate gender-based power, while others were launched to work around or even undermine gender-based inequality. I won't be able to provide you with a history of gender in Jewish organizations in the United States, or more particularly as it is studied. When people say gender, they really mean women. So the history of Jewish women's organizations, which date to the early part of the 19th century. But I can point you to several excellent sources for that retrospective view if you like. What I will try to do this evening is to reveal what cutting edge research says about gender, and then help us reflect on the implications of these insights for the future of gender in Jewish organizations. I'd like to point out that Jewish organizations vary greatly, and that part of that differentiation is based on competing ideas about gender. Distinctions about the public or formal roles of women in particular have animated organizational boundaries. Gender has been and remains central to the mission, structure, division of labor, economy, programming, clients, participants, staff, leadership, and life work of Jewish organizations. Gender permeates Jewish organizations in different ways, from the spatial layout of Jewish summer camps where boys and girls bunk or pray separately, to who runs Hebrew schools versus who runs synagogues, to Jewish youth programs aimed at nurturing heterosexual marriages, to the persistent and vibrant 100-year-plus history of Jewish women's charitable, civic, social, and religious organizations, often seen and treated as auxiliary sisterhoods to the main organization, despite their robust character and reach. And here I want to invoke Hamilton and say that sisterhoods get the job done. We also have recent efforts to bring boys and men back to correct the so-called gender imbalance in Jewish life through a revival of men's clubs. The success or lack of success in that area is something to consider. We also have the subversive nature of egalitarian organizations like Maharat, the first yeshiva to ordain women as Orthodox clergy. And we also have the emergence of LGBT-led synagogues, in large part because mainstream synagogues were unwelcoming at best. So conflicts over gender are not new, but today's personal, policy, and political debates about gender do raise questions about the future of gender in Jewish organizations. To help us thinking about this, I'm going to talk a little bit about language and vocabulary. A shared vocabulary helps ground discussions about gender in more nuanced, productive, and respectful ways, because when it comes to gender, knowledge is a project under construction. Like any area of human life, language evolves to describe concepts previously unknown or unnamed. Furthermore, gender terminology varies by place and time, and even by person. Terms that may have been accurate or acceptable once or within a certain group may now be considered inappropriate, inaccurate, or ill-fitting. As a result, it's not possible to know everything about gender-related language. So use the words you have for now, while acknowledging that they may not be sufficiently precise or universally applicable, and then ask questions to learn more. Just as each of us appreciates having our names pronounced correctly, I know I do, the language we use matters. especially for people whose gender experience is not reflected in our mainstream conversations. The handful of basic terms I'm going to talk about briefly include sex and gender, gender identity, and gender expression, and they are drawn from a much longer and ever-changing list of gender-related language. So first, sex and gender. Even before a child is born, their parents wonder whether the boy will be a boy, male, or a girl, female. Once informed, often based on a review of an ultrasound image or what medical professionals think they see of the fetus's genitals, parents likely imagine the colors, the clothes, the toys, activities that they can anticipate for this now already gendered child. Such aspirations are based on social expectations about gender, the unique ways that girls and boys should look and act. In this sense, a child is born into existing ideas about gender. Children quickly become attuned to gender norms communicated to us by parents, peers, and popular culture. These social ideas about gender are assumed to correspond with the marker used to denote the sex of the baby. M for male, boy, and F for female, girl. This marker is officially assigned at birth based upon physical examination of the size and shape of a newborn's external genitals, and then filed with the state's Vital Records Office. At first glance, classifying a newborn's sex appears to be a simple act of observation. However, this determination is actually quite complex. In fact, a person may develop in ways that are different from the usual gender binary mode of either male or female by having one or more variations in their external anatomy, internal anatomy, hormone production and or reception, chromosomes, and or secondary sex characteristics. When known, the term intersex is used to classify such individuals with these variations. The distinction between sex and gender, on the one hand, and gender identity, on the other hand, is premised upon self-definition. Although the box checked on the birth certificate is thought to be consistent with a person's gender identity, the mechanism by which you define yourself is located between your ears. A person's sense of their gender identity, who they are, is a largely internal dynamic. By age 3, children usually have this internal sense of their gender. When an individual's gender identity is aligned with the sex gender assigned at birth, they may describe themselves as cisgender, C-I-S gender, cisgender. It's a chemistry term. A person whose sex gender assigned at birth doesn't align with their gender identity might describe themselves as transgender or trans. Some trans people embrace the gender binary and simply refer to themselves as either a man or a woman. Others will describe themselves as trans men or trans women. However, still others who reject the gender binary, regardless of their sex or gender assigned at birth, may describe themselves as non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender fluid, or by other terms, and some use the pronoun they. In short, gender identity is how you define yourself, and a person's gender identity may only be known by that individual unless they tell you what it is. We just celebrated National Coming Out Day. In contrast, gender expression is how a person communicates this aspect of themselves to other people. Each day, for example, you make choices, we all make choices about how, when, and where to convey our sense of femininity and masculinity through our name, pronoun, appearance, and behavior, what clothes to wear, which activities to participate in, how to move your body or use your voice. For some people, these choices are habituated and made without conscious thought, whether gender conforming or non-conforming. Others intentionally craft their public perception and presentation in ways that could be socially expected or unexpected for their gender. Now, I understand trying on new terminology may feel awkward at first. We enjoy being knowers and being confident about how we speak and what we're saying. Yet having people around you use accurate and affirming language always feels good. Jewish organizations may wish to familiarize staff, volunteers, leadership, and members with these foundational concepts and incorporate gender inclusive resources and recommendations into policies and practices. So the question to think about here is, to what extent are the Jewish organizations that you are a part of ready, willing, and able to do so? And let's now look at some of the social science and then later on the science that tells us about gender today. The anthropological record suggests that the concept of gender is widespread, although when present, not universal in its application. In other words, how many genders are recognized, what gender means, how relevant an identity it is, what role gender plays in organizing society, how gender interacts with other classifications such as race, ethnicity, social class, ability, or nationality, will be neither defined nor experienced the same in all places. Perhaps surprisingly, although there are embodied elements to gender, quote, this is a quote from one of my fellow anthropologists, the reality of human biology is that males and females are shockingly similar. There's arguably more variability within than between each gender, especially taking into account the enormous variability in human physical traits among human populations globally, unquote. So what it is to be a man or a woman is culturally constructed, a human invention, which we are socialized into and may embrace or resist throughout our lives. Illustrations of this variability can be found around the world, some with and others without the gender binary as we know it today in North America. The categorization of society based primarily on the gender binary, or even what constitutes gender more broadly, is not an element inherent to the human experience all over. Notably, illusions of gender as an autonomous or natural state of being is challenged by evidence of how the power of the state and our organizations are used to reinforce a particular gender ideology. Take the term two-spirit, for example. It was coined in the late 20th century by Native North American activists to move away from the imposed colonial notion of a gender binary and to represent a unifying connection to previously venerated roles in tribal traditions. The term today is used by some Native or Indigenous people to describe those who have both a masculine and feminine essence or traits. Efforts to quote unquote civilize Indigenous peoples' gender systems by making them align with Western ideas about the gender binary via boarding schools, for example, here in Arizona, was central to the mechanics, the mechanisms of European and US colonization. So examples such as two-spirit demonstrate how gender varies by place and time and how gender may inform few or nearly all facets of a person's life, how gender is a social institution and not merely an individual identity, and how gender already exists and always exists within a construction zone. We see variation too among non-human animals. Lemurs, this is not a picture of lemurs, I know you know that. Lemurs, similar to ants and elephants, live in a social system known as a matriarchy, where a female or females possess primary power when compared to males. Moreover, the state of being female or male in some animals is itself a dynamic process rather than an obvious fact. We can take the word of marine biologist Mara Hart, who explains how all parrotfish are born as females and how all clownfish, think Finding Nemo, are born as males. At a point in their lives, some individual members of these aquatic species transition to the other sex. When during this process might we classify them as female or male? Consider two non-human primates, which you do see on your screen, who are genetically closest to us, about 99%. Chimpanzees on the left, bonobos on the right. The Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology's 3 Chimps Hominoid Psychology Research Group, that's a mouthful. They've traced how these two relatives of ours exhibit nearly opposite sex-based behaviors, male-dominated chimps and female-dominated bonobos. Sex differences, also known as gender dimorphism, in the non-human animal world may not be as predictable or as stable as we assumed. So if we use gender as a way to categorize each other, it makes sense to acknowledge that the gender system one society or community or group uses may not reflect the gender system found in other sites. This suggests to me, at least, that the gender ideology or system associated with any specific moment or location is not the way things have to be or ought to be, which moves at least some of us away from the explanatory framework, secular or religious, that such gender differences are innate or ordained. However, gender has and does play a significant role in our everyday lives. As a result, gender may be a useful variable to classify human beings for at least some purposes. Organizations, for example, may use gender as a variable to track possible patterns and attitudes. For example, how does gender affect perspectives on programming? Behavior. How does gender affect member donation levels? Conditions. Why are women underrepresented in organizational leadership? Or changes over time. Why have men left non-Orthodox organized Judaism at such high rates? The use of gender as a variable in these instances to measure patterned similarities or divergences is based on a pre-existing normative framework that applies only in a particular place and time. The question remains then, under what circumstances do we want gender as we know it to play a role? And if so, what kind of roles should gender play in our organizations? For what purpose does gender matter in our organizational decision-making in terms of policy, programming, and practices? Given the enduring structural inequalities found within the gender binary, whether it's pay disparities, access to roles or responsibilities, what we call the glass ceiling and the sticky floor, emotional and professional labor that's put out by underrepresented people, or simply the pleasure and opportunities generated by being surrounded by people with whom we identify, some of us may need or want to have a space of one's own gender. We want to connect, share experiences, learn, and collectively strategize to undermine gendered injustices of all kinds. This is reflected, for example, in the endurance of identity-based activities, affiliate groups, or gender-segregated single-gender organizations. Single-gender programming or organizations may address these concerns while also creating unintended consequences. It could, for example, reproduce inequality by devaluing those at the margins while maintaining the center as the more normative and powerful. It can also create expectations about the homogeneity of a particular identity group. For example, thinking that all men or all women have the same interests. Not true. It also can reinforce a rigid gender binary. So we ask the question, are women and men naturally different? Putative differences between men and women tack between two explanations: biological determinism, nature, and social constructionism, nurture. In her study of sexology, sociologist Janice Irvine noted a sustained tension between natural and cultural science, between viewing sexuality and gender as an innate biological force versus seeing it as a socially and culturally mediated force. It has not been a balanced debate between these explanatory frameworks. This has been exacerbated by the influence of science-like talk or scientific discourse in North America. We also tend to resist the notion that scientific knowledge is a product of its own time and culture, built implicitly on the assumptions or worldviews held by the scientists who create our knowledge. Biological determinism has been and continues to be a popular way to think about gender. Historians of science have excavated how research related to men and women has tended to begin with the assumption that sex is a meaningful distinction, that women are inferior to men, or at the very least, they are a poor modification to the man as standard model of the species, and that these differences are due to women's bodies. In this way, contemporaneous gender ideologies are read onto the human body, whether by type of humors, women being cold and moist, men being hot and dry, the ideal body type, or metabolism. Men were thought of as more active and women were more passive. Perhaps anatomy is the variable that you're looking at. Men's brains, contours, their volume, their weight or structures were purportedly bigger, heavier, or more developed than supposedly, thus delivering higher cognitive abilities. Or perhaps you're looking at hormones, where men's destiny is to dominate due to the so-called sex hormone testosterone. Researchers have attributed to a naturalized and value-laden dichotomy women's lack of eligibility for otherwise universal rights, or our constrained access to, or pathways within education or employment. Over the centuries, science has teleologically legitimated existing customs and laws that advantaged white men and maintained white women's supposed inferiority to them. Researchers who have noted differences between men and women at times describe this gap as relatively neutral or complementary. Women have unique strengths that men do not, for example. An assortment of psychological models, some feminist, some remarkably anti-feminist, have taken this position, starting with the premise that men and women were different. For example, women are more caring and men are more powerful. And explaining how and why this is so. You might remember, check your bookshelves, in the 1990s, a tepid self-help version of this worldview was disseminated in the best-selling Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus book. Notwithstanding widespread criticism of the book and others like it, the metaphor stuck, regardless of whether readers considered biology, nature, or culture, socialization, to be at the root of the distinction. Scientific advances in neuroscience have allowed for brain imaging of living people and also have given researchers a new field in which to search for gender differences, further solidifying the notion that women and men are hardwired differently. How often do you hear that men are left brain oriented, they're more logical, whereas women are right brain oriented or more emotional, to explain disparate outcomes for men and women? Gender differentiators place a spotlight on distinctions, however small or lacking in significance, and largely ignore what men and women hold in common. These presumed gender differences are then used to explain inequalities, such as the low number of women in positions of leadership or the level of violence perpetrated by men. For over a century now, scientists have scrutinized the newly visible blueprint of life, known as DNA, in order to determine the roots of gender. Geneticists learned that every living organism is driven by the double helix of DNA chains. The human genome was found to consist of DNA sequences housed on gene segments within 23 pairs of chromosomes. The first 22 pairs were simply enumerated, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Suggested names for the 23rd pair were based on their structure, their size, and their shape, except for one, sex chromosome, which ultimately was settled upon. Its name focused disproportionate attention to the very small percentage of the chromosome that had any relationship with gonads. And the term sex chromosome was not merely nominal, not merely its name, it was also normative. Early on, scientists assigned cultural ideas about gender to this poorly named chromosome. The larger one of the pair was known as X, denoting female, and the other smaller element was known as Y, meaning male. Historian and philosopher of science, Sarah Richardson, outlines how scientists related to X and Y chromosomes in their research, as if they were a heterosexual couple with complementary, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, personalities and roles, engaged in a battle of the sexes, quote, never able to understand each other, and the arbiter of and closest approximation to sex itself, unquote. The stories that scientists told about that 23rd chromosome newly encoded the enduring ideology of the North American gender binary into our genetic makeup. Both older and newer approaches to gender differences rely on essentialist ideas of a gender binary grounded in nature, fixed upon birth, determinative of persons' attributes, and thus our inevitable life circumstances. Today, researchers are taking a step back to question which mechanisms produce knowable contrasts between men and women. New insights reject the either or debate between nature and nurture, embracing a both and approach known as the biosocial turn. In doing so, they draw our attention to gender as a lifelong developmental process formed in tandem with and in response to opportunities that surround us or obstacles placed in our way from conception to death. We now understand the human brain as a pliable organ formed by a constant feedback loop throughout our lifespan that alters how we think and what we do. Cognitive neuroscientist Gina Rippon argues, quote, that the world is a brain influencer and a gendered world is what produces gendered brains, unquote. She found, for example, contra the myth that girls naturally lack spatial skills, that after playing Tetris and video games, girls' brains and spatial activities or spatial abilities change measurably. Biologist Anne Fausto Sterling similarly takes the biosocial turn and uses dynamic systems theory to explain the landscape of gender development by studying, quote, how cultural differences become biological differences. And the images you're seeing are from some of her work, where she's pointing to the different kinds of inputs that create different kinds of outputs in terms of our gendered landscapes over the lifespan. According to her research, the body acquires nervous, muscular, and emotional responses as a result of a give and take with its physical, emotional, and cultural experiences. Gender differences are evidence and effects of our iterative, embodied, and social interactions, our everyday lives with the world. If I have time, you can ask me about the next slide, but I'm going to move on. A number of concerns are at stake in the disproportionate search for or presumptions of differences between men's and women's bodies, especially in our genes and brains, which today are viewed as the primary sources of human essence. These actual or projected differences are not without inequitable evaluation or impact. Seeking out differences without accounting for either commonalities or causal developmental processes results in stereotypes and gender policing. Ultimately, this perspective contributes to some of our bodies being deemed sinful by religion, pathological by medicine, and/or criminalized by the state. To what extent are our organizations based on, buying into, or busting out of these naturalized distinctions that may not apply universally? Which brings us to the third question. Is gender a mutually exclusive binary? And the images you're seeing here, I'll tell you those stories. New research insights into the complex, processual, and dynamic work inherent to our gendered lives, as well as advocacy efforts by and on behalf of those negatively affected by rigid gender boundaries, lead to questions about the gender binary and explorations into gender conceptualized as more expansive, as a spectrum. The meaning of gender has undergone multiple transformations over time, and it continues to evolve in terms of how people configure and do gender. Similar to variations found cross-culturally, we find variations in gender across generations, spanning centuries. And here, I'm going to look at just two ideas: Jewish thought about multiple genders and the challenge of defining gender using a rigid gender binary model. As many of you understand, Jewish thought across religious streams holds in common the belief that God now said, "Let us make human beings in our image after our likeness, and let them hold sway over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the beasts, over all the earth, over all that creeps upon the earth." So God created the human beings in the divine image, creating them in the image of God, creating them male and female. Some have argued that this foundational statement, including the phrase "B'Tselem Elohim," sets the stage for embracing gender nonconformity and genders beyond the binary. According to Rabbi Elliot Kukla, for example, ancient Judaism understood gender as embodying multiple forms: cis male, zachar; cis female, nekeva; trans masculine, ilonit; trans feminine, saris; bigender, androgynous; and agender, tumtum. Rabbi Mark Semeth argues that the Hebrew Bible offers a highly elastic view of gender, with Eve being referred to as he and Adam as they, as them. Leah Anderson, at the time an out trans student at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, incorporates these insights and considers her gender transition as a mitzvah. Such textual taxonomies and rituals of gender diversity offer us opportunities to think outside of the inherited gender ideologies that help construct our own belief systems and our organizations. Scientists also confront the gender binary in their data analyses, where they find a wide range of chromosomal, internal and external anatomical, hormonal, and cellular variations. Eric Verlaine, now the director of the Center for Genetic Medicine Research at Children's National Health System and chair of the Department of Genomics and Precision Medicine at George Washington University, studies disorders and sex development, shared his insights into the complexity of gender in a recent piece in Nature magazine. Quote, "So if the law requires that a person is male or female, should that sex be assigned by anatomy, hormones, cells, or chromosomes? And what should be done if they clash?" he was asked. His response, quote, "My feeling is that since there is not one biological parameter that takes over every other parameter, at the end of the day, gender identity seems to be the most reasonable parameter," unquote. By invoking the term gender identity, he's advocating for self-determination, that is, self-definition of one's gender identity. New discernments of gender's complexity raise three nested questions. If sex and gender can be defined in more than one way, then which data sources should be used to determine gender? Should binary-based contradictions across these data sources be reconciled? And if so, how? Ultimately, who should be able to determine a person's gender? As members of community-based organizations, we may want to engage these questions and consider what varied responses and recommendations mean for our mission, policies, programs, and practices. New ideas continue to emerge across the sciences, social sciences, and the humanities about the multiple meanings we give to gender, the diversity of its manifestations, and limits inherent to managing it. Public attitudes towards gender are changing, with younger generations growing more gender literate. Akin to being literate in any topic, understanding its key concepts and mapping its parameters, gender literacy refers to, quote, strategies for decoding societal gender rules and sorting out one's own beliefs and values, unquote. Becoming a gender literate individual requires critical insight into how gender works in a specific place and time, and, quote, being able to name these gender rules while at the same time being aware of what can happen if you don't follow them, and then deciding if we want to adhere to them or not, unquote. Social science research indicates that young people in North America are increasingly doing gender their way. Overall, in terms of enthusiasm for an opposition to the gender binary, more youth, but not exclusively youth, embrace non-traditional gender identities or gender expression. A representative sample generated by the California Health Interview Survey found that 27% of adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17 were gender non-conforming. This translates close to 800,000 youth statewide. A more recent survey indicates that 2.5 people between 18 and 24 across the United States identify as gender non-binary, meaning they fully reject the gender binary. Youth are not alone in their rejection of the gender binary or their embrace of those who reject it. Nearly half of us see gender as a spectrum rather than a binary. And about 1 in 5 people in the United States know someone who uses a pronoun other than she or her. In fact, the pronoun they, as you see, was Merriam-Webster's word of the year in 2019. Clearly, accumulating evidence demonstrates shifts in people's attitudes about and practices related to the gender binary. Attitudes towards gender-based differences as seen through the lens of a fairly rigid gender binary remains, but they are softening. So do organizations wish to cultivate the capacity to welcome all the ways that people do gender? Given the range of perspectives on gender and the extent of gender variance among our friends, family, membership roles, and community, this question deserves further exploration and reflection. None of the quote unquote sides of our current social reality are as tidy or as blurry as they may seem. Gender ideologies and the work required to uphold or subvert them are messy and complex. Each day we make decisions about how to enact, live in, reinforce, and reimagine our gendered world. And the purpose of my comments this evening on multidisciplinary scholarship from the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities is to encourage discussions of what it might look like to be intentional about the ways that gender shape our organizations, to move forward in our programming and in our organizations, and to anticipate the intended and unintended consequences for our Jewish world in how gender shapes our organizations. In closing, at this midpoint in the fall semester at ASU, I'm reminded that many of my undergraduates were born about 20 years ago, and that their lives have been marked by a series of world historical events, 9/11, the Great Recession, and now the pandemic, among other upheavals. Notably, in times of great disruption or national conflict, gender can become re-traditionalized, and gender can also be subverted. So the question remains, how do we want gender to show up in Jewish organizations moving forward? I welcome your questions or comments that may engage this at the theoretical or at the more tachlis level. So let's have a conversation. And you are muted, Chava, the most popular phrase of 2020.
Sorry about that. I didn't notice that I was on mute. I'm so pleased to participate in this event with you. This was a fabulous lecture, and I would like to just pose one or two questions to you, and then we'll open it to discussion. I've noted the omission of one word from your lecture, and that's the word feminism. Where did feminism disappear as gender became more fluid and more diversified? Does it still make sense to talk about the feminist goals, the feminist vision? What's your take on it?
I love this question. Partly, it's funny, the thing that is so foundational and instrumental and informative in my life and the kind of research that I do drops out. It sort of becomes the water that we're swimming in. So I would say that feminism, both feminist movements in the plural and feminist ideas, again in the plural about gender, are definitely at the forefront, really started the conversation about what gender is and why gender roles can be constraining and also liberating, depending upon your point of view. We also have a tension going on in our world between those who are concerned about gender as a fluid kind of category and who wish to protect the idea that men and women have perhaps unique lives, circumstances, needs, wants, etc. So there are debates going on within feminism about the future of gender, which is not a bad thing. We all have to figure out where we stand on that continuum as well. But I would suggest that pretty much everything that I've talked about this evening has at its heart, at its foundation, the very feminist idea to question our current circumstances, to question the conditions which produce our ideas about gender. So I would be lost intellectually, personally, professionally, without the inheritance and the continued I would say really creative ideas about feminism and gender. To note, the comment I made about the homogeneity, the expectation that if we're in an identity group, an affiliate group, or a single gender organization, that all of us somehow are going to be the same or have the same needs or wants, that itself is a feminist question. Are women of a class by themselves, or the differences within us, how meaningful are they? And I would argue that the differences among us are also quite meaningful, and that we can learn from each other about how to be in coalition and stand in solidarity with each other in and across our organizations.
Yes, okay, we can spend a whole evening just unpacking that complex issue. But my other question pertains to another thing that I did not hear, or I heard very little about, and that's biotechnology. Would you agree that on the one hand, we have more awareness of the possibility of gender fluidity, but a lot of it became possible because we have new technology that makes possible, for example, this complex surgery that allows a person to really change a lot of the bodily expression of one's identity. So how do you understand the function of technology? Is it becoming more fluid and more present because of the technology or not?
You know, there's this, I think we have a similar conversation about, have gay people existed all the time, or only since we moved to the cities and had experiences in meeting one another and forming an identity, right? Is gayness an identity, or just a same-sex sexual desire that has existed since time immemorial? And I think we can have kind of a similar conversation around gender fluidity. Clearly, we know that gender is defined in so many different kinds of ways. I mentioned that notion of two-spirit among some Native and Indigenous peoples. So we know for centuries upon centuries that even the categories, the numbers of genders that people acknowledged or recognized has varied. So we didn't necessarily need biotechnology to do that. We had sources of knowledge that came from feelings, observations, really worldviews, that gender expressions and gender identity and even gender roles vary. So that itself does not require the kind of technology that you see in the Research Triangle Park, or perhaps, you know, somewhere in Northern California, or in Thailand for that matter. The kind of technology that you're talking about, I did reference in my comments, in that there seems to be this interesting continual search for the distinction between men and women by using new cutting edge forms of technology. You know, before it was about the humors in your body, right? Now we're talking about the fMRI images we have of our brains, and we're assigning meaning to what we're looking at on those blurry images. More recently, we're looking at chromosomal differences potentially. So we seem to be always being on a quest to solidify, to kind of map what that distinction is. And personally, I can say, if there are differences, I'm personally perfectly okay with that. The question is, what meaning do we give to it? What value do we give to those distinctions? Last thing I'll say is, in terms of technologies that enable people to affirm the gender that they know that they are, they've been around for decades. They've gotten better and better. They've also gotten really expensive. And because health insurance doesn't cover transitions or affirmations for the most part, it can be very, very difficult for people to be who they ought to be and be perceived of as who they ought to be. So that's a policy question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to open up the Q&A now for the audience. And Lisa, why don't you tell us if we have any questions from the audience?
We don't have any questions right now, so if you want to ask.
If that's the case, I'm going to ask another question so we can continue the conversation. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
All right. So here's another thing that really I would like to hear more about, and that's the psychological pain that is, or angst and or anguish that goes with that kind of dysphoria in some cases, or a mismatch between what feels inside and what is the biological conditions. So can you tell us kind of what do social scientists or psychologists specifically are telling us today that can help alleviate some of those challenges?
Well, from the social science, and from people's lives, right? From people's experiences and what the people who are experiencing what is called gender dysphoria or body dysphoria, from people who have those experiences, we learn from both sides of the medical desk, if you will. We learn that because there's so much emphasis placed on the distinction, on this gender binary, that when our bodies don't align and don't affirm who we know we are between our ears, we can experience severe mental anguish and pain, as you suggested. When our buildings, when our organizations are built around a gender binary, the people who have that kind of tension, if you will, around gender, are constantly being forced to choose. Which door do I go in? Which bathroom do I use? Which team can I play on? What should I fill out on the form? How many forms do you fill out that say male or female? Sometimes I'm not sure why they're asking. So our organizations, our institutions, all of our assumptions, the way we treat people who may not appear in a gender conforming way, it's really the rest of us who are producing that kind of pain for people who are not gender conforming or who are not cisgender. Of course, within people's bodies, within their experiences, they too need the kind of support and resources, whether it's emotional, whether it's medical if they want, or legal if they want. Every person who is transitioning has their own transition. There's a saying that if you met one trans person, you met one trans person. So on the one hand, I want to point out that there's incredible amount of pain and harm and violence against people who are gender nonconforming and or trans, particularly trans women of color in our country here in the United States. On the other hand, we can make some remedies available at the institutional level, right? At the interpersonal level, so that intrapersonal work can be done by that person.
Yeah, I'm very much with you. But as you look at Jewish organizations, um, if we're going to move beyond any gender binary, which I guess you can make very good arguments in favor of doing that kind of a move, but there's going to be a price to pay for every change we make, socially speaking. We pay some price. So what would be the price? Let's say, let's get rid of all the sisterhoods. Let's get rid of anything which is based on female only or male only. So what would be the price that we're going to pay within the Jewish community if we're going to tell women, you know what, ladies, forget about it. We're not going to have special group of women studying anything together because, you know what, we are now into a gender fluidity kind of situation. So what would you say to these people?
Well, the joy of thinking through ideas is such that you can look at from above almost some of the intended and unintended consequences. And I think we can look to history as somewhat instructive here, potentially. And I'm not putting the kibosh on getting rid of a gender binary. What I'm saying is, in somewhat agreement with you, Chava, is that at least prior to feminism and prior to feminist transformations or our attempts to transform organizations and institutions, we had this so-called gender inclusivity, which meant that men dominated our organizations and there was no space for women. So we've been through that before. We've been through that kind of universalized generic approach where everyone so-called is welcome, although some places had explicit rules against women entering, of course. And the fact that women did not advance was then blamed on women, right? It was a blame the victim kind of approach to so-called gender inclusive or gender neutrality. So I don't think any of us want to go back to that kind of framework. What we do want to go to, I would argue, is a framework that enables people to self-identify, to self-determine, and have organizations that are flexible and aware enough that they can anticipate and work with and be guided by people who may not fit this gender binary to make sure that everyone's getting what they need and want. Which means maybe there are programs where it's single gender and people who identify with that gender, however that it's defined by them, get to participate. And that there are also so-called gender fluid, gender neutral, gender inclusive kinds of programs where whoever wants to can participate, right? So that instead of saying it has to be either or, let's take the both and. Let's see what makes sense. And as an example, I can end with that there's been this rumble that men and boys are leaving organized Jewish life other than in Orthodox settings. And this idea is to try to animate men's clubs. And in the few examples that we have, men have not been that successful in doing this. And this is an interesting empirical question that I can't answer right now, why? But they mostly were doing things that were like about building them up, right? They're kind of in that stage of let's talk to each other as men about our lives. And then they started doing more social programming and eventually the men were saying, you know what, I want my wife here. I want my children here. And so they started creating programs that were so-called co-ed, right? Gender inclusive. So these men's clubs may be a mechanism for bringing more men into an organized Jewish life. And it may be that men are organizing activities where more than men want to participate. It's really interesting. It's kind of a hybrid model. It really is, we all can take responsibility for building the future of gender in our Jewish organizations. That's why I think it's so exciting. It doesn't have to be the way it's always been.
Maddie,
Right.
we have 3 questions now.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to just look at them because they're kind of very similar. But the first one is, how do we provide inclusive programming in our community for all ages? How do we break down exclusivity and resistance across generations?
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to start the last one first about the gender nature of Hebrew language, which is really interesting. And there are people who are inventing new ways of speaking, not only in Hebrew, but in other languages that are less gendered. So that's a whole other kind of study that I haven't done, but that other people could talk to. In terms of dismantling single gender auxiliaries, think about the word auxiliary, right? Auxiliary means away from or in support of, or an attachment, an extra piece, something that hangs over, hangs off, but it's also vital. So the work that women's auxiliaries have done in the Jewish world, in Jewish organizations, is quite stunning. You know, in preparation for this work that I've been doing on these comments in the paper, I've read some of this history, and it's not the kind of, I'm not trying to be pejorative here, but it's not women just sewing, although there was a really interesting Jewish women's sewing organization. But Jewish women have been at the forefront, for example, of immigration systems to bring immigrants into this country. They've been at the forefront of peace negotiations. They've been at the forefront of healing families. They've been at the forefront of making sure that Jewish families aren't hungry. They're not just doing what you would consider to be traditional women's issues, right? But they're also doing things that matter to more women than men. For example, working on domestic violence, or ensuring that children are being educated. So women's organizations, whether they're satellites, auxiliaries, sisterhoods, whatever you want to call them, from the beginning of the 19th century, have been doing immense amount of labor, and almost always unpaid. So lots to think about there. So I'm not suggesting that we dismantle them necessarily. People need to engage in these conversations. It doesn't have to be a rule coming down on high. It is about communities bringing people together to have this process of conversations. In terms of practicalities, I want to share my screen really briefly because I know we're limited on time, because I anticipated some of this practical, pragmatic idea, which I love. Let me see if I can get to it. Well, that's a wonderful film, but we'll see. We'll go past that. Okay, so here's something to take a quick look at, and I'm happy to send this to folks who want it. But there's different ways that you can take steps to think about being gender inclusive in your organization. And that is at the very beginning, like, oh, I didn't know this term gender binary. Let's think about that. What does it mean to me? How does it affect my life? How do I reinforce it? How do I like it? How do I reject it? And then moving forward to talk about what kind of values undergird the gender binary, or your rejection or your ambivalence with it. And moving forward, the chart that I have here moves along this arrow, and it moves forward and it asks you to, figure out what you don't know and do some homework from trustworthy resources. I do some of this training. For example, I'll be doing a training for the Jewish Family and Children's Services, JFCS, the next couple of months with their staff. You can honor people, you can follow people and their identities. Maybe it's not your identity, but you can acknowledge and affirm someone else's. You can speak up. You can discern, I'll keep moving down to keep this quick. You can discern between the kind of individual changes that you want to make and the kind of institutional and organizational ones that you'd like to advocate for, or at least explore more. And then the other piece is policies and practices. And this is really more at the heart of, as an organizational leader or member that you want to become an advocate, the kind of steps that you can take that will help you create your goals and then figure out what you need to accomplish them, and then track and evaluate your pursuit of those goals. And there's different areas that you can work on. One of the things that has been pointed out, in fact, there was a New York Times article about this just a few weeks ago. A lot of the work that I do is within schools, and this example is from a school, that there was a same gender lesbian family that was really lamenting in 2000, we got 2020 now, lamenting the fact that the school forms still had mom and dad on them, that they hadn't figured out that all you have to do is just put parent and guardian 1, parent and guardian 2, that so many of our families are diverse. We have stepmothers and step parents and grandmas raising children, and our forms can easily reflect the family diversity and gender diversity that we have in our world. So if you belong to an organization, one of the first things you can do, it's a relatively easy one, is just take a look at the forms. What are you asking about? How are you asking about gender? Why are you asking about gender? And then how are you asking about family formation? So that's something that you can do. And I wanted to just point to, if I can figure it out, there we go. This is just a very short version of some resources for folks who are interested. and again, I can forward this to people, you can take a screenshot of some of the organizations that are working around gender, working on gender, trying to figure out what gender means. And that there are these kind of conversations happening in all different streams of Judaism and Jewish life. There is an egalitarian partner, I think they call it partnership minyanim, among Orthodox Jews. There's about 20 or 25 of them, I believe, around the world, people who are praying in these gender egalitarian kinds of ways within an Orthodox framework. So there's something out there for everyone.
Wonderful. Lisa, is this the last question we are going to address?
Yes, I think we've covered them all.
Okay, so on behalf of all of us, I would like to thank Professor Adelman for sharing her vast knowledge of this very complex and important topic. And I hope that all of you will take some of what you've learned in this wonderful evening and apply it to your life in particular way.